Imagine a city that began with a campfire on a hill and grew to become the heart of the entire world. An empire where every road led to a single point, where the fates of millions intertwined like threads in a vast tapestry of time. Today you'll hear the story of ancient Rome, from the legend of the she-wolf to the quiet decline of the empire that changed the course of history. If you enjoy these journeys through the ages and want to support the channel's growth, subscribe and give it a like. It helps create new stories you can always revisit before bed. And now, open this page with me. Long, long ago, before the great cities rose and the roads stretched across the earth like threads of silver, there was a river. The Tiber moved slowly, the way rivers do when they carry secrets. Its banks were lined with reeds and willows, and in the evenings, when the light turned gold and the birds grew quiet, the water seemed almost to whisper. Of course, rivers cannot speak, but this one had much to remember. On the hills above the river, before anyone had thought to call them by name, the land was green and wild and full of possibility. Wolves moved through the long grass. Eagles turned lazy circles in the summer sky. And somewhere in the space between the forests and the open fields, a story was beginning. The kind of story that starts not with a plan, but with a miracle. The story went like this. There was once a princess, a gentlewoman of royal blood, who had been made a priestess against her will, kept from the world, kept from living any ordinary life. But fate, which cares very little for what people intend, brought her together with a god, Mars, the god of war himself, proud and blazing as a forge fire. And in the way of old stories, something extraordinary came of it. Twin boys. When they were born, her uncle, a hard man, the kind who feared what he could not control, ordered that the children be taken away and drowned in the river. He was the king, and he worried that two grandsons of royal blood might one day take his throne. So he gave the order, and his servants obeyed, as servants of cruel kings often do. But here is where the river kept its first secret. Instead of drowning the boys, the waters carried them gently to the shore. The basket that held them, some say it was a simple clay pot, others a wooden cradle, came to rest under a fig tree at the foot of the Palatine Hill. And there, as the sun warmed the mud and the world went about its business all around them, something impossible happened. A she-wolf came. She was large and silver-gray, with amber eyes and a low, careful step. She should have been frightening. She should have eaten them, but she did not. She lay down beside the twin boys, and she let them feed from her, as a mother would. She kept them warm through the cold nights. She guarded them until a shepherd, a kind man named Faustulus, found them at last and brought them home to his wife, and the two boys grew up in the hills, not knowing who they truly were. Their names were Romulus and Remus. You might wonder, did this really happen? Did a wolf truly nurse two babies on a muddy riverbank? Perhaps not. Stories, especially very old ones, tend to stretch and shimmer like heat rising from summer stone. What matters is not whether every detail is true, but what the story means. And this one means something important. It says that Rome was, from the very beginning, two things at once, wild and strong, dangerous and tender. It was raised on wolf's milk, which is to say it was shaped by fierceness, by survival, by the kind of toughness that cannot be taught, only lived. But it was also a place where the impossible could happen, where the river might carry you safely instead of swallowing you whole, where even a wolf might choose kindness. That is the soil Rome grew from. The twins grew into young men, fearless and capable, leaders even before they knew it. They gathered other young men around them, the bold ones, the restless ones, the ones who didn't quite fit anywhere else. They drove out the cruel uncle who had tried to have them killed. They found out who they truly were. And then, as happens when two powerful people share one dream, they disagreed. Where should the new city be built? Romulus wanted the Palatine Hill. Remus preferred the Aventine. They decided to let the gods choose, the way people did in those days, by watching the sky for omens, for the flight of birds, for signs. Remus saw 6 vultures circling above his hill. Then Romulus saw 12 above his. 12 was more than 6. Romulus declared himself the winner. Remus laughed at him, or mocked him, or leapt over the wall his brother had begun to build. The old stories aren't quite sure which. But something went wrong between them, in the hot, proud way that things go wrong between brothers, and Remus died. Whether by Romulus's own hand or someone else's, the earliest city was stained before it had even grown its first walls. This too matters, because Rome would always carry that shadow, the shadow of brothers in conflict, of greatness mixed with grief, of building something magnificent on ground that had already known pain. But life continued, as it must. Romulus built his city. He drew a line in the earth, a furrow they called it, made by a plow drawn by a white bull and a white cow. And that line was sacred. That line was Rome. It was small enough that you could walk around it in an afternoon. It had wooden gates and thatched rooftops, and fires at night that smelled of pine and animal fat. It was, by any reasonable measure, quite ordinary. And yet, Romulus knew that a city is nothing so without people, so he made Rome into a place of welcome, or at least a place that asked few questions. He opened its gates to runaway slaves, to exiled men, to wanderers and debtors, and those who had nowhere else to go. They came from all across the hills and valleys. They came without much to offer except themselves. And that, it turned out, was exactly enough. Because Rome did not grow great by being pure or perfect or chosen. It grew great by being open, by pulling together people of every kind and making them, somehow, into something shared. The city was a mixing bowl, rough, noisy, argumentative, alive. There were early kings after Romulus, 7 of them, each one different. Some were wise, some were foolish. One was a great builder. Another, the last, was so proud and cruel that the people finally rose up and threw him out altogether. And when they had done that, they stood in the streets of their city and made a decision that would change the world. They would not have another king. Never again would one man hold all the power. Instead, they would share it, spread it out, argue over it, check and balance it, the way you might share a loaf of bread so that no single person gets too much. They called what they made a respublica, public thing, the thing that belongs to everyone. We call it the Republic. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, the city sleeps on its hills above the slow, secret river. The wolves have gone back into the forest. The fig tree still stands, or at least the memory of it does. And in the small, smoky houses on the Palatine, ordinary people, people who had run away from trouble and arrived somewhere new, are closing their eyes, listening to the Tiber moving in the dark. They do not yet know what Rome will become, but something is beginning, something that will, in time, fill the whole world. The word republic is old enough to have almost worn smooth, like a coin passed through too many hands. But once it was new and sharp, and it meant something that had never quite been tried before. It meant this: no single person should hold all the power. It sounds simple. It is not simple at all, because power, like water, always finds its way somewhere, and keeping it spread evenly, keeping it from pooling in one place, from flooding, from drowning everything around it, that takes constant, careful work. It takes laws and argument and people willing to push back even when pushing back is dangerous. The Romans, to their credit, understood this, and so they built something remarkable. At the top of it all sat the Senate, a gathering of Rome's most important men, gray-haired and serious, draped in white togas with a stripe of deep purple at the hem. They met in a building near the heart of the city, and they argued endlessly about taxes and roads and wars and treaties, about who should lead and who should follow, about the price of grain and the position of the stars and 100 other things besides. Above the senators, and yet still bound by them, were two men called consuls. They were the highest officials in the Republic, and they ruled together, which is to say each one could stop the other from doing anything too rash. They served for exactly 1 year, not a day more. Then they stepped down, and two new consuls took their place. This was deliberate. This was the point. If you can only hold power for a year, you cannot build an empire for yourself. You cannot stack enough stone to make yourself a king. The Romans had seen what kings did, and they had decided firmly that they would not have that again. Below the consuls were other officials, men with titles that sound musical even now: praetors and quaestors, censors and tribunes. Each one had a different job. Each one had limits on what he could do. The whole machine was designed to slow itself down, to make sure that no single voice drowned out all the others. It was imperfect, of course. The wealthy had more say than the poor. The old families had more say than the new ones. But the idea, the beautiful, difficult, stubborn idea at the center of it, was real, and it was new, and it mattered. Rome grew, first slowly the way a fire catches, just an ember, then a small flame, then something larger. The city spread beyond its original hills. Nearby towns were absorbed, sometimes by war, sometimes by agreement, sometimes by the quiet gravity of a place that was simply too useful to resist. The Romans were not always gentle neighbors, but they were often surprisingly fair ones. When they conquered a people, they frequently let the people keep their customs, their gods, their local ways of doing things. They asked for soldiers and taxes in return. In exchange, they offered roads, laws, protection. It was a trade, unequal, yes, but not without something on both sides. This was how Rome learned to grow without breaking, not by erasing what it found, but by adding to it, by making more room. By the middle years of the Republic, Rome controlled most of the long boot of Italy, and standing at the southern edge of that boot, looking out across the blue, salt-smelling water of the Mediterranean, Rome began to see something further away. On the other side of the sea, on the northern coast of Africa, there was a city. Its name was Carthage. Carthage was magnificent, rich and clever and ancient, a great maritime power with ships that moved across the Mediterranean like pieces on a game board. Its merchants traded in silver and silk and purple dye. Its generals were brilliant. Its navy was the finest in the known world. And it was growing in the same direction as Rome. What followed were 3 long, brutal, exhausting conflicts that the Romans called the Punic Wars. They burned across decades and across oceans, and they changed both cities forever, though only one of them survived. The first war was mostly fought at sea, and Rome, a city that had barely built a proper navy before, had to learn the art of sailing almost from scratch. They did. They lost ships by the hundreds in storms and in battle. They built more. They lost those too. They built more again. Eventually, grinding and costly as it was, Rome won. But the second war was the one that nearly ended everything. Carthage sent a general, a man of extraordinary skill and cold, precise intelligence, marching overland from Spain, across the great snow-capped spine of the Alps, down into the heart of Italy itself. His name was Hannibal, and his army included elephants, enormous and grey, thundering through mountain passes that no army was supposed to cross. For 15 years, Hannibal moved through Italy like a storm. He crushed Roman armies in battle after battle. At a place called Cannae, in a single afternoon, he destroyed the largest force Rome had ever assembled. Tens of thousands of soldiers killed before the sun had moved far across the sky. It was one of the worst military defeats in the ancient world. And still, Rome did not surrender. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Republic in its middle years. Not that it always won, but that it refused, with an almost frightening determination, to admit that it had lost. When Hannibal's messengers arrived carrying bags of gold rings taken from the fingers of dead Roman knights, expecting Rome to beg for peace, the Senate voted instead to keep fighting. They sent another army south, and another, and another. Hannibal could win battles. He could not win Rome's will. Eventually, the Romans took the war back across the sea to Africa itself, and Carthage was forced to recall Hannibal to defend his homeland. He was beaten at last on African soil at a battle called Zama. The war was over. Rome had survived. But survival changes people. The legions came home from those long wars harder than when they had left. The generals who had led them came home with something else too. Not just glory, but a taste for it. A hunger for the kind of respect that does not come from debating in the Senate or waiting your year as consul. The kind of respect that comes from 50,000 soldiers who will follow you anywhere. Meanwhile, the wars had shifted the land beneath Rome's feet in ways that were slow but deep, like roots splitting stone. Small farmers, while their sons were away fighting, had lost their fields to wealthy landowners who bought them up cheaply. The cities swelled with the poor and the landless, people who had nothing to sell but their labor, and increasingly, not even that, because wealthy Romans were buying slaves by the thousands, brought back from conquered territories to work the great estates. The Republic, that careful machine of checks and limits, had been built for a city of farmers and traders, all roughly equal, all with something to lose. It was not built for this, for an empire stretching across two seas, for generals with private armies, for hundreds of thousands of people with nothing and nowhere and no stake in the way things were. Reformers tried to change things. Some of them were killed for it. The arguments grew louder, then angrier. The streets of Rome, which had once been the place where citizens went to vote and debate and be part of the great public thing, became places where fists flew and sometimes blades. The Republic had not yet fallen, but it had begun, very quietly, to shake. On the Tiber, the river still moved in the same slow way it always had, carrying leaves and light and the reflections of torches burning on the banks. If you had stood there on a still night in those years, you might have heard the city humming with all its arguments and ambitions, all its fears and its future. Something was shifting, something vast and unstoppable, the way a tide turns. So gradually you cannot point to the moment, but real all the same. The next chapter would bring the storm. There is a river in northern Italy, smaller than the Tiber, quieter, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, called the Rubicon. In the time of the late Republic, this river was not famous for its beauty or its fish or the towns that sat along its banks. It was famous for one thing only. It was a line, a boundary drawn not in stone or wood, but in law. On one side of the Rubicon lay the Roman provinces of the north, where a general might command his army and do as he pleased. On the other side lay Italy itself, and Rome, where no general was permitted to bring his soldiers, not ever, not for any reason. The law was old and serious and very clear. To cross the Rubicon with an army was to declare war on Rome itself. It was an act that couldn't be undone, any more than a word spoken in anger can be pulled back out of the air. In the winter of 49 BC, a man stood on the northern bank of that small, cold river with his army behind him, and he thought about what he was about to do. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was not a simple man, and it would be a mistake to pretend he was. He was brilliant, dazzlingly, almost unnervingly so. He was a general who could read a battlefield the way a musician reads a page of notes, instantly, completely, seeing things others missed. He was a writer whose words were so clear and sharp they are still read today, 2000 years later, in schools across the world. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming, effortlessly, dangerously, in a way that made you feel, when he looked at you, that you were the most important person he had ever met. He was also ruthless and ambitious and convinced, perhaps correctly, perhaps not, that Rome needed him more than it needed its old rules. He had spent nearly a decade in the far north and west, in the wild provinces the Romans called Gaul, the lands that would one day become France and Belgium and parts of Germany. He had fought war after war there, against tribes of fierce and complicated people who resisted Roman expansion with everything they had. He had won, at enormous cost in lives on both sides. He had written it all down in clean, careful Latin, sending dispatches back to Rome so that everyone would know exactly what he had done. And what he had done had made him, to many Romans, something close to a hero. But back in Rome, powerful men were afraid of him. They saw what he was becoming, or what he already was, and they moved to strip him of his command, to bring him home as a private citizen, vulnerable to the enemies he had made along the way. They thought that without his army, he would be manageable, ordinary, stoppable. Caesar understood what they were doing, and on that cold bank, with the Rubicon moving dark and quiet before him and his soldiers waiting in silence behind him, he made his decision. He crossed. What followed was a civil war, Rome against itself, which is perhaps the cruelest kind of war there is, because everyone fighting knows the faces on the other side. Caesar moved south with astonishing speed, and city after city opened its gates rather than resist him. His great rival, a general named Pompey, fled across the sea to Greece with much of the Senate in tow, hoping to regroup, hoping the distance would give him time. It did not give him enough. Caesar followed, fought, and won. Pompey was killed in Egypt, betrayed by people he had trusted, and Caesar stood alone at the top of the Roman world. He was not cruel in victory, by the standards of the age. He pardoned many of his enemies. He made plans, serious, thoughtful plans, for reforming the calendar, rebuilding the city, restructuring the way the provinces were governed. He moved with the energy of a man who believes he can fix everything if only he is given the time. But time was exactly what his enemies were determined to deny him. In Rome, a group of senators, men who called themselves liberators, men who genuinely believed they were saving the republic, made a plan of their own. They were led by two men of contrasting character. Cassius, who was sharp and practical and had personal reasons for his hatred of Caesar, and Brutus, who was something more complicated, a man of deep principle, a man Caesar had trusted and even loved, a man who convinced himself that what he was about to do was not murder, but medicine, that Rome was sick, and this was the cure. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of that month, in 44 BC, Caesar came to a meeting of the Senate. He had been warned. He had been told by friends and by a soothsayer who stepped out of the crowd to speak to him directly that this day held danger. He came anyway. Perhaps he did not believe it. Perhaps he was simply too proud to show fear. Perhaps at some level he could not have named, he was simply tired. The senators gathered around him as if with a question, and then the blades came out. 23 wounds, the accounts say. Caesar fell at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey, and the marble floor of the Senate ran red, and the men who had done it stood holding their daggers and looking at each other in the ringing silence that follows an irreversible act. They had meant to save the Republic. What they had actually done was something quite different. The death of Caesar did not restore the old order. It shattered what remained of it. Rome fell into chaos, a lurching, violent, miserable chaos that lasted for another 13 years, grinding through betrayals and alliances and battles and assassinations until the world was exhausted and desperate for someone, anyone, to make it stop. 3 men formed an alliance to avenge Caesar and carve up the Roman world between them. Mark Antony, who was Caesar's most loyal general; Lepidus, a capable man who would eventually be shouldered aside; and a young man, just 19 years old when Caesar died, who had been named in Caesar's will as his adopted son and heir. His name was Octavian. He did not look like a conqueror. He was slight and often unwell, thus prone to illness in a way that made people underestimate him. He had no great military genius. He relied on a brilliant general named Agrippa to win his battles for him, which is itself a kind of genius. What he had instead was patience and cunning and an almost preternatural ability to understand what people wanted and to give them just enough of it. He and Mark Antony, who had fallen deeply in love with the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra and made his home in her golden court on the Nile, eventually they turned against each other, as men who share power always seem to do, eventually. The confrontation came at sea, off the coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, in 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was broken and scattered. They fled back to Egypt, and when they understood that there was no escape and no future, they each chose to die rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. Octavian was left standing alone. He was very careful about what he did next. He did not call himself king. He had watched what happened to men who reached too openly for that word. He called himself instead the Princeps, the first citizen, and he spoke often and warmly about restoring the Republic, about returning power to the Senate, about being merely a servant of the Roman people. The Senate, exhausted and grateful-less and not entirely foolish, played along. They gave him a new name, a title, really, more than a name, that carried a sense of the sacred, of something set apart and luminous. They called him Augustus, and Rome, which had been a republic for nearly 5 centuries, became something new without quite admitting to itself that the change had happened. The Senate still met, the consuls were still elected, the old words were all still said in their old places. But when Augustus spoke, the world listened. And when he decided, that was what was done. The Republic was over. The Empire had begun. Augustus lived a long time, long enough to see the thing he had built settle into its own shape, the way fresh mortar slowly hardens into stone. He ruled for over 40 years, and when he died, an old man in a small town in southern Italy, the empire did not collapse or fracture or dissolve into the chaos it had so recently escaped. It simply continued. That perhaps more than any battle or any building or any law was his greatest achievement. He had made something that could outlast him. He had given Rome not just an emperor, but the idea of an emperor, a position, a role, a shape that the next man could step into, and the world would keep turning. His stepson Tiberius took his place. Then others followed. Some were capable, some were strange, some were genuinely terrible, but the machine kept running. The armies marched, The grain ships sailed, the courts held their sessions. The roads carried the endless traffic of soldiers and merchants and messengers and pilgrims. Rome had become, in some deep structural sense, larger than any single person who sat at its center. This is what an empire is, at its heart. Not a man, a system. And what a system it was. At its greatest extent, the Roman Empire stretched from the cold, rain-soaked edge of Britain in the northwest, where legionaries in heavy armor stood shivering on Hadrian's wall and stared out at the fog, all the way southeast to the baking deserts of Egypt and the distant shimmer of the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. It swallowed the Alps and the Rhine and the Danube. It wrapped around the entire Mediterranean Sea, that vast blue basin of trade and culture, as if the sea were a lake and Rome owned both its shores. 40 to 50 million people lived within its borders, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, eating different food and wearing different clothes and building their houses in different shapes. And yet they were all, in some meaningful sense, Romans, or they could be. The remarkable thing about Rome was how much it was willing to include. The roads made it possible. If you have heard one thing about ancient Rome, it is probably this: all roads led to Rome. And while that is not quite literally true, it is not far wrong either. The Romans built roads the way other civilizations built temples, with religious devotion, with extraordinary skill, and with the clear conviction that they were doing something that would last forever. They were right. A Roman road was not a dirt track beaten flat by feet and hooves. It was an engineered thing. Layers of sand and gravel and crushed stone and fitted paving blocks, raised slightly above the surrounding land so that rainwater drained to the sides rather than pooling and rotting the surface. The roads ran straight because the Romans believed, correctly, that the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line, and they had the surveying skills and the stubborn determination to cut that line through whatever lay in the way. Forests were cleared, hillsides were carved, bridges were thrown across rivers with an offhand confidence that still impresses engineers today. Along these roads moved everything that kept the empire alive. Soldiers marching in step, the sandals raising a steady rhythm on the stone. Merchants with wagons piled high with olive oil and wine, with pottery and silk and pepper from the Far East. Government officials carrying sealed letters, runners with urgent messages, ordinary travelers, families, pilgrims, traders, making the way from one end of the known world to the other. The roads were also how ideas moved, how Latin spread, how Roman law crept into distant provinces, how in time a new religion called Christianity, born in a small corner of the Eastern Empire, among people who had no particular reason to love Rome, was spread until it had reached every coast the roads could touch. But the roads, impressive as they were only the beginning. Step into a Roman city of the imperial age, any city, in Italy or Spain or North Africa or Syria, and you would find yourself somewhere surprisingly familiar. Not identical to a modern city, but recognizable in its bones. There were streets laid out in careful grids. There were markets busy with commerce. There were public spaces, the forum at the center of town, where people gathered to talk and argue and conduct their business, that served the same purpose as a town square anywhere, in any era, There were bathhouses. This is one of the details that tends to surprise people. The Romans were devoted to bathing in a way that was unusual for the ancient world, and the bathhouses, the thermae, were far more than places to get clean. They were social institutions. You went to the baths the way people today might go to a cafe or a gym or a public park. You soaked in warm rooms and hot rooms and cold plunge pools. You got a massage. You played board games. You argued about politics. You made business deals. You gossiped. The bathhouses were where Roman civic life actually happened, in the warm, steamy, surprisingly democratic space between one citizen and another. The water for all this, for the baths and the public fountains in the private homes of the wealthy, came via the aqueducts. These were engineering marvels of the highest order, long channels, sometimes running for dozens of miles, carrying fresh water from mountain springs down into the city at a perfectly calculated gradient, using nothing but the pull of gravity. Some of these aqueducts crossed valleys on towering stone arches, structures so well built that pieces of them still stand today, 2,000 years later, looking almost ready to carry water again. The people who lived inside this world were as varied as the empire itself. At the top were the wealthy, senators and knights and great landowners who lived in elegant houses built around open courtyards, where fountains played and frescoes covered the walls in vivid colors: deep red, ocean blue, warm ochre yellow. They ate at long tables laden with foods from every corner of the empire. The children were educated by private tutors in Greek and Latin both. They kept slaves, many slaves, to run the households, to cook and clean and carry and teach and tend the gardens. Below them were the merchants and craftsmen, the backbone of the Roman economy, who worked long days in small shops that opened directly onto the street, selling bread or wine or cloth or pottery or ironwork or 100 other necessities. They lived modestly but often comfortably, in apartments above the shops or in the dense, noisy tenement buildings that packed the city's residential neighborhoods. And below them were the poor, the many, always the many, crowded into the upper floors of those same tenements, where the stairs were steep and the rooms were small and the smell of the street rose up through the window in summer. They relied on the public grain dole, which the emperors maintained with great care, understanding that a hungry city was a dangerous one. They went to the public baths because they had no baths of their own. They gathered in the forums and the theaters and the amphitheaters, because those spaces, unlike almost everything else in the ancient world, were truly public, open to all. The amphitheaters deserve a moment of honesty. The most famous of them, the Colosseum in Rome, finished in 80 AD under the Emperor Titus, was a wonder by any measure. It seated perhaps 50,000 people. Its system of vaulted arches and underground chambers was a masterpiece of engineering, and what happened inside it was, by modern standards, appalling. Gladiators fought each other, criminals were executed, wild animals, lions and bears and elephants brought from the far edges of the empire, were hunted and killed in the sand. The crowds watched and cheered and argued over their favorites, the way people today argue over sporting teams. It is uncomfortable to hold both things at once. That Rome built things of breathtaking beauty and engineered systems of extraordinary sophistication, and that it also filled its grandest building with blood for the entertainment of the masses, but history rarely offers us the luxury of simple admiration. The Romans were human beings, complicated, capable of great things and terrible ones, often in the same afternoon. The emperors of the Golden Age, Augustus, Vespasian, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, each left their mark on the physical world as in stone and marble and bronze. Trajan pushed the borders of the empire to their furthest point, deep into what is now Romania, and built a column to celebrate it that still stands in Rome today, its spiral of carved soldiers and battles rising 30 meters into the Italian sky. Hadrian traveled ceaselessly through his empire, inspecting and building and questioning, and left behind not just a wall across Britain, but a magnificent temple in Rome, the Pantheon, whose dome, a perfect hemisphere of poured concrete, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. Marcus Aurelius wrote a private journal of philosophical reflections, thoughts about duty and mortality, and how to be a good person in a world full of difficulty, and it has not been out of print since it was discovered. Even now, it is worth reading. The empire at its peak was not a perfect thing. No human construction ever is. But it was a real thing, enormous and humming and alive, connected by its roads and its laws and its shared language and its sheer improbable ambition. It believed it would last forever. Most things that believe that are wrong. Nothing lasts forever. This is perhaps the oldest truth there is, older than Rome, older than the hills it was built on, older than the river that still wound its slow way through the city long after the last emperor had gone. Every child knows it, in the way children know things before they have the words for them. Every summer ends, every fire burns down, every great and glittering thing, given enough time, goes quiet. Rome knew it too, in its bones, even at the height of its glory. The Roman poets wrote about it constantly, about how even stone crumbles, how even the mightiest cities return to grass and silence. They built their monuments to last, and they wrote their elegies about impermanence. And perhaps these two impulses were not contradictions at all. Perhaps you build most passionately precisely when you understand, somewhere deep in private, that what you are building will not stand forever. But knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are very different things. The trouble did not begin all at once. It never does. It began at the edges. The Roman Empire was by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD almost incomprehensibly large. To govern it properly, to move armies to where they were needed, to collect taxes, to administer justice, to keep the roads repaired and the grain flowing, required a degree of coordination that strained even Rome's remarkable administrative abilities. Messages took weeks to travel from the frontier to the capital. Decisions that needed to be made in days sometimes waited for months. The sheer physical scale of the thing was beginning to work against it. The way a tree that has grown too tall becomes vulnerable to the wind in ways a smaller tree never would. And there were winds. From the north and east, beyond the Rhine and the Danube, beyond Hadrian's Wall, beyond the last Roman outposts, in the endless forests and grasslands, lived peoples the Romans called barbarians, a word that originally just meant foreigners, people who spoke languages that sounded to Roman ears like meaningless noise. Bar bar bar. These were not primitive people, despite what Roman writers sometimes claimed. They had their own complex societies. their own traditions of craftsmanship and warfare and law, their own fierce pride. And they had been pressing against Rome's borders for centuries, testing, probing, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes simply waiting. In the 3rd century, the pressure became something more sustained. Tribes and confederations, the Goths and the Vandals, the Alemanni and the Franks, began moving against the empire's frontiers with a new urgency, driven partly by their own internal politics and partly by a great churning of peoples across the Eurasian steppe, one group pushing another westward like a slow and enormous wave. Rome pushed back. Rome always pushed back, but each time it cost more soldiers, more gold, more attention pulled away from the 1,000 other things an empire needs to survive. Inside the borders, things were shifting too. The economy, which had hummed along so reliably during the Golden Age, was showing cracks. Wars are expensive, and Rome had been fighting almost continuously for generations. The silver content of Roman coins, the denarius, that small disc of metal that had been the backbone of trade across the known world, was quietly, steadily reduced as emperors desperate for revenue stretched their resources thinner. Less silver meant the coins were worth less. Merchants noticed. Prices rose. People who had saved money in coins found that their savings bought less than they used to. The comfortable predictability of commerce began to fray. Tax collection thus became both more urgent and more brutal, as the state needed more money to pay its soldiers and its debts. In the countryside, farmers who had already lost so much over the previous centuries now found themselves squeezed still harder. Some simply abandoned the land and moved to the cities, or attached themselves to the estates of powerful local landowners who could offer some protection in exchange for labor and loyalty. This arrangement, a person tied to a piece of land, working it in exchange for the Lord's protection, was the seed of something that would flower more fully in the centuries after Rome, a world historians would call feudal. Rome planted it without knowing it. The emperors themselves became part of the problem. During the 3rd century, a period historians sometimes call the crisis of the 3rd century, which is one of those historical labels so accurate it almost makes you laugh. Rome went through more than 50 emperors in 50 years. Some reigned for a few months, some for a few weeks. They rose on the shoulders of their armies, and they fell when those same armies decided someone else might be more generous with the pay. Generals murdered emperors. Emperors executed rivals. The Senate, once the proud and quarrelsome heart of Roman governance, became increasingly ceremonial, a group of men who announced decisions made by soldiers, rather than making decisions themselves. This was deeply destabilizing, in the way that any institution is destabilized when its leadership changes constantly and violently. Confidence is fragile. People, merchants, farmers, city administrators, local officials, need to believe that the rules will be the same tomorrow as they are today. When emperors change every few months, when loyalty to one man might mean death at the hands of his successor, people stop investing in the future. They stop building. They stop taking risks. They pull inward, protect what they have, and wait. There were attempts to stabilize things. Genuine, intelligent, sometimes heroic attempts. The Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD after surviving the chaos of that terrible century, recognized that the empire had simply become too large for one man to govern. His solution was radical and logical in equal measure. He divided it, not into separate empires, at least not officially, but into two administrative halves, East and West, each with its own emperor and its own systems of government. The hope was that two centers of power could respond more quickly to the crises that kept erupting at the edges. It helped for a while. Constantine, who ruled in the early 4th century, made two decisions that would shape the next 1,000 years of history. The first was to embrace Christianity, that faith that had spread quietly along Rome's roads for 3 centuries, surviving persecution and misunderstanding, until it had woven itself into the fabric of the empire so thoroughly that suppressing it would have been like trying to remove the salt from seawater. Constantine did not suppress it. He adopted it, legalized it, supported it, built churches for it, and in doing so, set the Western world on a course it is still traveling. His second decision was to move the capital. He chose a city in the east, the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, sitting at the precise point where Europe and Asia nearly touch, a narrow channel of water between them like a held breath. He rebuilt it grandly and named it after himself, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was a wise choice, and it tells you something about where the real vitality of the empire now lived. The eastern half was richer, more urban, more commercially active, more deeply connected to the great trade routes that ran toward Persia and India and China. The eastern cities were ancient and sophisticated. The eastern provinces had not been so badly disrupted by the crisis of the previous century. The West was another matter. In the West, the pressure from outside never truly let up. The Visigoths, one of the Gothic peoples who had been pushing against Rome's borders for generations, had actually been allowed to settle inside the empire in large numbers, given land in exchange for military service. It was an arrangement that seemed practical, and it was, until it wasn't. Mistreated by corrupt Roman officials who cheated them of the supplies they had been promised, hungry and angry, the Visigoths rose. In 410 AD, under the king Alaric, they did something that had not happened in 800 years. They sacked Rome. They walked through the gates of the Eternal City and spent 3 days taking what they wanted. And while the damage was perhaps less total than the shock suggested, Rome was not burned to the ground. Its people were not all killed. The psychological wound was immense. The city that had believed itself eternal, the city that had stood at the center of the world for 1,000 years, had been broken open by people it had called barbarians. Augustine of Hippo, a theologian in North Africa, heard the news and sat down to write. He wrote for 13 years. The result was a book called The City of God, an argument that earthly cities always fall, that they are not the point, that something deeper and less perishable than marble and legions was what mattered. It is one of the most influential books ever written, born directly from the shock of Rome's humiliation. The Western Empire staggered on for another 66 years after Alaric's sack. Different groups moved through it. The Vandals, the Huns under the terrifying King Attila, the Ostrogoths, Each wave left it weaker, hollower, less able to defend itself or administer itself or believe in itself. And then, in 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer simply deposed the last Western emperor, a boy of 16 whose name, with a bitter poetry that history sometimes manages, was Romulus, the same name as the founder, the first and the last, sharing one name, separated by 12 centuries. Odoacer did not bother to appoint a new emperor. There was no one left who would have believed in the title. But the Eastern Empire, Constantinople, Byzantium, did not fall, not then, not for nearly 1,000 years more. It continued, reinventing itself century by century, keeping the Roman flame in a different vessel, until 1453 AD, when the Ottoman Turks finally took Constantinople and the last ember went out. And even then, it did not truly end, because Rome had already done what all great things eventually do. It had dissolved into everything around it. Its language became French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and Romanian. Its laws became the foundation on which European legal systems were built, and through them, the laws of half the world. Its calendar, adjusted and refined, is the one you use today when you check what day it is. Its architectural ideas, the arch, the dome, the column, are in almost every public building you have ever entered. Its name is still given to cities and months in the very script in which these words are written. So here is what the end of Rome actually looks like, if you step back far enough to see it properly. It does not look like a catastrophe. It looks like a river reaching the sea. The water does not stop. It does not disappear. It spreads out, wide and slow and quiet, mixing with everything it meets, becoming unrecognizable as a river and yet still, undeniably, water. Still moving, still carrying what it always carried. The roads outlasted the legions that built them. The laws outlasted the courts that administered them. The language outlasted the empire that spread it. And the idea that human beings might organize themselves into something larger than a family or a tribe, something built on shared rules and shared responsibilities, and the radical, difficult, never quite achieved notion that power should be limited and answerable. That idea did not die in 476 AD. It is still alive. You live inside it. And so the book slowly closes. The fire on the Palatine Hill has burned down to its embers. The forum is quiet. The colonnade silver in the moonlight. The stones still warm from the long day's sun. The Tiber moves as it always has, carrying its ancient cargo of memory downstream toward the sea. Somewhere, a wolf calls out once from the dark hills, and then is silent. And Rome, with all its noise and ambition, its cruelty and its beauty, its roads and its laws, and its long impossible story, breathes out slowly, like a sleeper settling into the deepest part of the night. Rest now. You have heard the whole story. And stories, even when they end, have a way of going on